Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the College of Forest Resources, I wish to welcome all of you to the Center for Urban Horticulture and to the 6th program in the Denman Forestry Issues series entitled Seeking Sustainability. Today's program is an outgrowth of considerable discussion at our college over the past several years as we have sought to define and articulate our strategic themes. The college is committed to provide world-class, internationally recognized knowledge and leadership for environmental and natural resource issues. Today, we look forward to an exciting and informative program that addresses many of these issues, and we have a panel of outstanding speakers who will address all aspects of this subject. Our moderator this afternoon is Mr. Brian Boyle. Brian is a former Washington State Lands Commissioner serving for 3 consecutive terms from 1981 to 1992. He was instrumental in founding the Tiger Mountain Advisory Committee, which led to the formation of the Tiger Mountain State Forest. He also was one of the originators of the Timber, Fish, and Wildlife process. He helped form the Sustainable Forestry Roundtable, and he appointed the Commission on Old Growth Alternatives, which led to the formation of the Olympic Natural Resources Center in Forks, Washington. He is no stranger to forestry issues in our state. He was also one of the founders and a current board member of the Mountain to Sounds Greenway here in the Puget Sound region. Presently, Brian is the chairman of our College of Forest Resources Advisory Board, and he is working with the college to bring to fruition the concept of the Northwest Environmental Forum. So it's with great pleasure I introduce Brian Boyle.
Thank you, Bruce. I was hoping we could all sit around like Louis Rukeyser and his crew in soft chairs and sort of emote, but we're not allowed to. Well, I'd like to quickly introduce the panelists again to you and say something very quick about what they said. And what we're going to do is, in the second stage, is do a question and answer process. Bruce Baer, who introduced me, is the Dean of the College of Forest Resources at the University of Washington, and spoke earlier about land stewardship ethics and the science and value preferences that are tied up in sustainability issues. Susan Charnley is a research social scientist with the Pacific Northwest Experiment Station of the U.S. Forest Service, and Susan was talking about sustainability and its vesting in social values. Bill Palak, to her right, is the superintendent of the North Cascades National Park complex and longtime Park Service person who was describing the Park Service as, in terms of its role as providing living laboratories and education and reference to the history of the past. Angus Brody, with the Department of Natural Resources, Assistant Division Manager here in the state of Washington of the Land Management Division, then was talking about policies and the policy drivers of the decision process toward the sustainable harvest of the DNR lands. Following him was Libby Soden, who is the supervisor of the Horticulture Division of Everett Parks, who gave us a very erudite description of Hewitt Avenue and in Everett, and how it now looks again like it did in the 1960s because of the conflicts between trees and sewer lines, but explained it in much more detail than that. Court Stanley is Vice President and Chief Forester of Port Blakely Tree Farms, and talked about how a family trust drives sustainability, which is terribly interesting. And then Claire Ryan who was Assistant Professor of Natural Resources Policy and has a long chain of other professor responsibilities in various colleges of this university, was characterizing institutional inhibitions and problems in adoption of sustainable forestry and adaptive management. And so with that kind of setting the stage, let's hear from you. Get some of the questions and we'll try to direct them. I'll try to redirect them to different people as I see might be appropriate. And we get to kick right off here with Susan Charnley. And I'm going to omit the editorial here and just go right to the question. And the question is of Susan, how can the Forest Service expect people to believe that the agency is committed to sustainable forest management? Susan, you want to tackle that? And if you don't do real well with it, we'll ask one of the other people. Maybe one of the people who are, I find this is a real softball question, so I know you can handle it. So.
Clearly, the forest management practices of the Forest Service haven't always been sustainable in the past, and there has been a fair amount of concern raised about that. I think with the new direction and the commitments towards sustainable forest management, I think that, actually I read this question earlier and it was sort of phrased in the context of in the context of the Bush administration and some of the sort of potential rollbacks of environmental laws, what's going to happen here. I think that there are laws that are going to continue to be in place that the Forest Service has to comply with that do mandate some degree of environmental protection, such as the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act. But I think kind of a key part of the equation is the social acceptability of forest management practices. And perhaps an example is with the Northwest Forest Plan. The Northwest Forest Plan, in fact, does allow for some cutting of old-growth forest. But if you look at what forest managers are doing on the ground, it's very rare that somebody proposes a timber harvest project that entails cutting old growth, because they know that if they do, there's going to be such an uproar and so many appeals, et cetera, that it's just not going to happen and people don't want to go there. So I think that it's important to consider in the management process the social acceptability of various strategies, and I think people quickly figure out that if you're putting something on the table that's not acceptable and that would perhaps entail some amount of environmental degradation, people don't want to go for it, that we don't go there. And of course, if we do, there's the public participation process. You can appeal, you can litigate, and that kind of puts a brake on some of these practices that may not be so sustainable. I guess that's how I would respond in part.
Any longtime observers of the Forest Service on the panel want to?
I would just add one
Claire?
thing, that question was really about trust, is saying that we don't trust the Forest Service. And that's what came up in many of these interviews and surveys on adaptive management, although I would add that people that had participated in the adaptive processes had a much increased level of trust, level of understanding of this is why the Forest Service decides things the way they do, what kind of a bind are they in. They hated the Forest Service less. So, part of it was building that relationship and building that trust, and that whole question is exactly, it's that issue, is we don't trust the Forest Service. But if you participate in some of these processes, some of that trust can be built. So I would just add that as an add-on.
Question, is there any interfacing with companies like Weyerhaeuser and Boise Cascade to make best use of forests with regard to understanding or with respect to building industry needs? I'm not exactly sure what I know what to make best use of the forest with respect to building industry needs means, but
The building industry?
talking about the interfacing with larger companies. I mean, Court, do you want to tackle that a little bit?
No,
I mean,
thanks,
here you are. Well, here you are describing a family trust with a longer term, with longer rotation. You called it non-declining even flow, I believe, on your lands, which is very different.
To the point we interface with large companies like Weyerhaeuser and Boise all the time. A lot of the issues that concern us concern them. Our main still focus, and what I brought up in the talk earlier, was that we need to keep the industry viable in the Northwest. And that means that Weyerhaeuser, Boise, and Port Blakely along with a bunch of others, have to remain viable. So in that aspect, there is some collaboration between companies within policy arena and research.
Bruce, as a board member of the Board on Natural Resources that oversees the Department of Natural Resources that Angus was referring to earlier, you have to be looking at the sustained yield calculation in terms of the effects of other adjoining land and landowners and things like that. So what about this interface question with other big landowners? What do you see? And maybe if you want to throw in, how about what the university is teaching in terms of the kind of collaboration between the people that work for these various people?
Gee, it's not often I get to answer for the University of Washington and the Washington State DNR all at once. I can't speak for either agency in this response. It's my own opinion. Boise has been a leader in looking at ecosystem management in the forest industry, and Weyerhaeuser has also adopted a sustainable forestry posture. Both companies obviously put a lot of weight on the economic sustainability circle that we were talking about earlier. That's their primary goal, is to stay in business. But they have, in both instances, in my opinion, gone a long ways towards ensuring that they are sustainable by looking at the other elements of sustainability, not just economic efficiency. The DNR, I believe, should also adopt a sustainable forestry posture for the Washington State timberlands. And I think, as Angus described, they're moving that direction very rapidly. The balance across those three metrics is where it hasn't been settled yet. That's partly a political issue, partly a legal issue, partly an economic issue, partly a social issue. So that's where the process is right now. Angus, I think, did a good job of outlining the trust mandate responsibilities that the DNR has to adhere to, but they have other responsibilities that he also talked about. So the balance in the case of the DNR has not yet been struck, so to speak, or has not been settled. But I think the industry model with its priorities and the Washington State Trust Land model with its priorities, even the federal model with its priorities are all taken into consideration when each one of those parties tries to sort its way through this process of defining for their organization what sustainability really means.
Here's one for Libby Soden. As urban populations rise, people place a higher value on our urban forests. What do you see as your greatest responsibility as an urban forest manager in the decades to come in balancing the conflicts and issues that inevitably arise?
I think my greatest responsibility would be, if we want to achieve sustainable amenities from our forest, we need to use some of the techniques of planting stands that will provide those very amenities. We don't have any income from those lands particularly, and we're kind of out there by ourselves in a way. Need to use a little bit of science, what species of trees do what, make sure that when we have disturbance or when trees have to come down for some reason or another, that what we put in will thrive where we plant it, take care of things so they grow. We're very much a single tree focus still where I work. Each tree is important, and to try to get the diversity in the stand so that you have that ongoing flow of the amenities that our folks are looking for is my biggest responsibility.
How about Bill? I mean, I'd like to see you kind of take that on also. I mean, the Park Service in the Northwest is known for managing, big parks, rural parks, and things like that. But the Park Service also has to manage some of the greatest urban conflict and urban overuse. The Forest Service has to deal with this in some areas too, but maybe you could take that on, Bill, and I'd ask Susan to respond as well after you're done.
I worked for a period of time at Roosevelt's home in the Vanderbilt Mansion in Hyde Park, New York, and that was very much an urban forest setting. I think the most important thing the Park Service has learned over the past 30 years or so is, I mentioned in my remarks that our view towards ecosystem management was a lot like a taxidermist, and others have called it freeze frame management. I think what we've learned is that even in an area that's preserved, that the processes are dynamic, and we simply need to recognize that and manage for a dynamic system and not try to freeze a condition in time or attempt to create a condition that's frozen in time.
Susan Charnley, the Forest Service has to deal with parks in Southern California that are being overrun by 20 million people, and I read in the paper the other day about all of the, you're saying in jumpers to burn down pot patches in Northern California and everything like that. So obviously the urban pressures are hitting the Forest Service as well. Do you want to talk about the major challenges just real quickly?
Certainly, some of the major challenges for us include not just the fact that urban forests have really huge visitor rates, but the fact that people are building houses much more frequently interspersed in what we call the urban wildland interface, and that creates real challenges for us in terms of, for example, fire protection, fire control issues. So there have been major implications along the lines of management for fire, for example, trying to manage those visitors, trying to accommodate visitors that are increasingly coming from different cultural backgrounds, for example, and want to make different cultural uses of the forests. I think the best that we can do is try and look at those trends and those pressures and figure out how to better plan for them as we move along with population growth and increasing diversity. And so that those are some of the issues that we are trying to address more directly.
Here's a little change. No mention of climate change. How can we talk about sustainable forests without factoring in climate change?
Actually, I did indirectly mention climate change, Mr. Moderator. Although it was very indirect, I'll agree, but when we were talking about...
The audience didn't hear you say it.
It was on that one slide where I was talking about the uncertainty involved and the environmental condition of our ecosystems as it's affected by broader environmental factors. And what I guess I didn't mention during my talk, so I guess I was at fault, was the fact that our ecosystems, our forested ecosystems, are subject to grave uncertainty when it comes to global climate and the changes that may or may not come in the next decades. We also have huge problems in terms of population pressure. We don't know what's going to happen with human disease. We don't know what's going to happen with human poverty. These all have, these uncertainties portend huge impacts on forest ecosystems, certainly in other parts of the world, but perhaps even right here at home. And that was part of the uncertainty when we're talking about sustainability. We have to factor those in. How one does that is an open question, but they're certainly, critical factors for us to think about.
Others? Climate issues?
We need to grow more trees.
There you go.
Well, if it gets warmer, the trees will grow faster, won't they?
There you go.
The bugs will grow faster too, though. Anything else on climate?
I would just say that some of the models that, I know Hamish mentioned modeling, and I know some of the modeling that's been going on in British Columbia tries to anticipate climate scenarios, and so that may be one way that that's incorporated. Of course, there's a huge amount of uncertainty, and what variable do you put in and at what level, but there is some attempt in British Columbia and some of the model forests to anticipate that, and I'm sure with the other models that Hamish was mentioning, that would be in there as well. I don't know if he's here to add.
No, Hamish had to leave, unfortunately, had to go back to British Columbia. Angus, this is for you, I think. There's a little preface that I think needs to be in here to understand the question. But the set of expected managed for benefits are well defined for the Park Service, City of Everett, and Port Blakely. But for DNR trust lands, future changes in societal demands will have a significant impact. How does the DNR reconcile this in its planning and harvest calculation efforts when 6 of the 7 alternatives represent zoned forests. Zoning a forest would be the last management decision to make if you wish to remain adaptive, as the DNR states as an imperative. Of course, this is kind of a question, or it's kind of more of a statement than a question, but I think it's something you might want to take on.
Well, I think to explain the approach of the alternatives around why they're dominated by a zoned approach is because it's really, that was what was adopted under the Habitat Conservation Plan. That was what was sort of agreed to as the initial strategies that we were going to employ and test out on the land base. There's some sort of security and certainty in those approaches. While the more unzoned approach or integrated approach that was designed in the Habitat Conservation Plan for the Olympic Experimental State Forest is very much of experimental nature. We don't know how it will play out in the long term. And that's not just the department, that's the federal services, that's our stakeholders, the tribes, etc. And I think the assurances that the board wanted and the department wants is to have a set of alternatives that are sort of progressing towards that integrated approach, which research and current understanding is saying, well, this is an interesting approach. There seems to be many benefits, both environmentally, ecologically, socially, from this approach. But as Claire pointed out, how do you actually do it on the ground? And I don't think we know. So I think the dominance of zoned approach is that's what we've agreed on in our Habitat Conservation Plan, and that's where the greater level of security and certainty is at this current time. Now, the first part of your question, though, referred to how do we adapt and change through time as a department. Well, I think this process that we're taking with this calculation sort of indicates what the department is trying to do in gathering public opinion, gathering information from stakeholders at a current point in time, gathering information around current research, and saying, what is the alternative approaches to management of trust lands today, and doing some modeling and building that into a decision-making process.
Here's a question. It is addressed to Bear, Kimmons, Charnley, Brody, Stanley. So whoever wants to be first, just put your hand up. How does the Forest Stewardship Council certification plan contribute to the sustainability models presented today? And secondly, what concerns do you have? Anybody want to be first on that, on Forest Stewardship Council? And I think whoever is first needs to give a one-sentence description for the audience of the Forest Stewardship Council. Otherwise, I'll do it, and that's more dangerous.
Why don't you do it?
No. Who wants to be first? Court, do you want to do it? You talk specifically about it in your thing. And
we've gone through the gap analysis with Forest Stewardship Council, and it's a certification scheme that worldwide that has been developed by a stakeholder committee specifically concerned with environment, social, and economic attributes. We've gone through the gap analysis. The Pacific Coast standards haven't been finalized yet. We came up fairly well within the Forest Stewardship Council's criteria. We're concerned if we follow the next step, depending on how the standards turn out, we'll have to take a hard look whether we can maintain our business and sustainability while going through FSC.
Anybody else want to add anything to that?
I think the Forest Stewardship Council, like the other certification schemes, provide a useful point of criteria and indicators that are important and what aspects are important for sustainable forestry. So they provide a sort of framework that can be used to guide organizations such as the department or private industries in developing sustainable forestry. I think the other thing is what they guide or what they provide is this third party that the court mentioned in his presentation about a third party recognition of an organization or a private company doing sustainable forestry, instead of just it being the organization or the company saying, we're doing sustainable forestry.
I don't know a lot about it, but my understanding is one of the strengths is that it's not just certifying companies that are engaging in ecologically sustainable forestry, but that it also has criteria for evaluating the social approach and the benefits to communities, indigenous people, what have you, whoever is involved in actually doing the harvesting, so that there's a social justice component involved in the practice of forestry, and it's not just ecological criteria. I also understand that in terms of federal forest management, we are not allowed or able to be certified on federal lands in terms of our practices, which I think is something that should be pursued and looked into in the future, because I think actually it would help to promote sustainable forestry on federal lands.
Maybe this, well, here's a question that I think it was addressed to Libby Soden, but I think any number of people could take this on. It has to do with particularly Bill and maybe plant species in the urban forest have changed greatly since the native forest was largely removed in the 1800s. Invasive plants have rapidly moved into the parks and greenbelts. What are the top invasive plant problems you face, and how are you dealing with them? You want to take that first, Libby, and then maybe talk about from the National Park Service standpoint.
There are some big invasive plant species problems. English ivy is, excuse me, one of the worst. Planted in our landscapes here and there and has taken over acres and acres of land, smothering all the understory and climbing up the trees and actually killing trees on many occasions. Another invasive species is Scotch broom, which takes over all our pore sites. It's a nitrogen fixer, and it's very happy on our sandy places like Jetty Island, any areas that are recently exposed, bare mineral soil or whatever. And the third big one that we really have difficulty dealing with is Himalayan Blackberry, which also will just engulf anything small that you plant, very prickly. What we do is work with volunteers. We certainly don't have staff or resources to address the issues, but we have lots and lots of volunteers who, for reasons, having run a brush cutter for many years, I don't understand really why they love to come out and pull ivy off of trees and whack blackberries down and the whole bit. But we have lots of people that are real enthusiastic about this, and we spend, we have 5 or 6 big volunteer projects a year with 40 to 50 people pulling these invasive species out of our woodlands.
For the Park Service, it's principally Japanese knotweed, and that's on the west side of the plant we're dealing with the most. And because it largely occurs on the water courses, it doesn't really do a whole lot of good if you're a midstream landowner to deal with the problem. You have to deal with it on a watershed or landscape basis, and that's the approach we're taking, working with Seattle City Light, working with the Nature Conservancy, working with various landowners. One of the things the Natural Resource Challenge brought us was funding for exotic plant management crews that are being organized much the same way that the Forest Service organizes fire crews. And they're not just hit teams of workers, they're people that have degrees in plant management. And they're becoming a very valued resource. We've got a crew at North Cascades. We've got another one on the Olympic Peninsula that's been working with ivy problems there. But I can't stress enough the need to look at these problems on a landscape level and not just a specific parcel of property.
Can I just add, I think the topic about invasive species really hasn't one that's been sort of thoroughly discussed in terms of how it's going to start to maybe impact production lands, and in the sense of looking for integrated management. I think as we move through rotations and as we have more interventions and more complex silviculture, we're going to have higher levels of intervention, and we're going to see plant communities that we want to survive being disrupted by invasive species. And I think that's going to be a huge challenge for us in the future.
And of course, it relates to invasive species in the water as well.
Right.
One of the things that I heard, and may lead into this question from all of you, was you were describing what you do and describing how you do it. And in some ways, you're describing what also drives the policies and actions of your different organizations or agencies. And I heard different amounts of clarity, ranging from Port Blakely, which clearly knows its role, City of Everett, which I think knows its role, and because it evolves, and the Park Service as well. I think that DNR polling the public, trying to determine what its role is and how it might have evolved in the last few years, and the Forest Service, a little less clarity, I think. I think Susan was very clear, but I'm not sure if the Forest Service is as clear as some of the others, and because it's of its responsibility. So here's the question. Much of what's printed in the media seems to be very black or white. In other words, conserving resources versus using resources. What's the plan? Are there any specifics to more effectively educate the public as to the complex nature of conservation? And then especially given the changes in U.S. administration, but I don't know if that makes a difference. I think you have the same responsibility and demand regardless. So what, can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, to start with, is educating the public really what needs to happen here? Start with that. And then maybe talk a little bit about what has to happen in terms of kind of formulating this public need, social responsibility, environmental quantification, economic requirements and things like that that you're all dealing with in the context of sustainability.
I think you've really answered the question, but
I didn't mean to.
Next question. No, I think education does play a huge role in it. A series such as this, Denman Forestry Issues series, certainly help. We need many more activities, not only addressing people that are already out of their formal education, but even in the education itself, whether it be down in the K-12 and then right up through higher ed. We need to recognize that the continuing urbanization of our population separates people from the land. They don't have some of these understandings of where, I forget which speaker talked about the Safeway example today. They don't know where certain things come from, where the older generation, like mine, we think we know. And I think this is part of education too. It's not an automatic no-brainer to many people about where natural resources do come from. That doesn't mean everybody will agree once they understand this. There's large shifts worldwide from the producing nations and the consuming nations. I was just in Taiwan a couple of weeks ago, and they made a policy change less than 10 years ago that they wouldn't harvest trees on their national timberlands, which is most of the forest land in Taiwan. Japan has had this posture for many years. Well, where do these countries then, from where do they get their products to satisfy their demands? Obviously it comes from other places. Well, we could do the same thing here. I'm not advocating this, but then there would be a huge shift to some other place in the world. So I think people have to realize if we're going to consume products that they have to be produced someplace, and we should leave the lightest footprint we can on the environment from producing these products. But I think the education has to be that these products are needed and they will be produced someplace to satisfy those needs. And environmental damage should be minimized, absolutely. But I think people have to be educated as to the trade-offs that are involved in these production processes.
What about educating the media? Do they need it?
Is it possible?
They claim they're educable.
I think education, has a fundamental role to play, as we do as professionals, and I think the role that we play is, there is a very serious temptation to paint a complex issue black and white as a process of education, and I think we've got to resist that. This is complex stuff, and it needs to be explained in context, but its complexity needs to be maintained.
Kurt?
Brian, we've had, for the past 10 or 12 years, we have an education program, an outreach with our company, where we primarily take fourth graders out into the woods, spend a half a day with them, and just explain what the role of private forests play in the context of their lives. We try to keep it balanced and fair. We've probably had 15,000 people go through that program to back up. Another one we have just started over the past few years is Teachers on Summer Assignment, TOSA, and we're trying to teach teachers. They'll spend a month or 3 months with our company going to work for us. And the main impact that we get back from these teachers is that they did not realize how complex and scientific forestry is, and that they never really knew what it takes to manage forest land. So we are trying to educate, but more at a grassroots effort.
Do you think part of this is the kind of the dumbing down of issues? That issues are explained in such a peripheral fashion, or barely explained at all, that the science side of it, you brought that up, the science side of it, the complexity of the issue isn't explained well enough? I mean, is there something more we could be doing to do that?
It's difficult to explain such a complex issue to the media when we're concerned with 2-minute sound bites or 30-second sound bites.
But now we've made it more complex by wrapping social expectations, environmental values, and economic needs into one big kind of looping group of things and saying we're going to meet all those needs at the same time. How can we explain that? I always look to the Park Service when I've got a really tough question, because I know you've got always an answer.
For at least the federal agencies, and I expect the state and the city as well, it's a matter of basic institutional survival to succeed at this. Because basically what the question you're asking is, how do land management agencies continue to make themselves relevant to an increasingly urbanized and diverse society? And if we fail in that, I don't know how we do it yet, but if we fail in doing that, we will lose our relevance to the American people, and we will fail to survive as institutions.
I think too, one of the things we do on a city level is involve all our fourth graders in a project we call Kids in Parks, and we get the kids out and they get to put chips down on trails or plant trees or whatever. But once you have children who are out there in the woods, the public access is such an important part. There's another faction of culture that wants to preserve everything and keep people out of public lands. You know, preserve means no public access at all, and certainly our mission in the park department is to bring people in, show them what we're doing, how things grow, try to explain how things work, and let them have a little hands-on opportunity to see what it is they're trying to preserve. So I think it's real important. Some of the public access issues are really important for our kids.
Claire, you talked about the organizational inhibitions and about adaptive management and sustainable forestry. What about the issue? How do you deal with? You want to take a stab at this whole issue of public knowledge, media coverage, and
I think
stuff
part
like
of
that?
what we found through this, and I think through some other studies, was, you know, which public. We use the word public very cavalierly, and through some of these efforts it was really getting clarity on who is the attentive public for this issue, and that may be very different than what we think of as the general public. And so doing a better job at identifying that public. Now that doesn't mean there's going to be other publics that later come in and say, I wanted to be involved in that or have something to say about that. I guess the other thing that came out in this was education through some of these participation kinds of, or being out there on the ground and understanding what kind of a job this is, what a difficult job this is. And so there was an education. It wasn't a formal, explicit we're going to educate you, but it was more an experiential kind of education that made it clear that, at least at the federal level, the forest managers had a very tough job, and people did start to understand that. I guess one other comment about kind of the science and the sound bites, part of that is just the difficulty in making things black and white, is that these sound bites are used in a way, we have these conflicts over values and what we should do and what we should decide, and so that science or the sound bites tends to get used in an advocacy way that is hard for some of the agencies to combat, in terms of they are trying to make a decision, yet they're faced with many different interpretations of what the science says, but it's used in a way of furthering a viewpoint or furthering a position towards that larger decision.
Angus, quickly, do you anticipate revenue losses based on stricter sustainability-oriented management for state forest trust lands?
That's an interesting question. Can we wait till summer?
Yeah, we'll just sit right here.
I think some of the alternatives will, may produce less revenue than what we're producing today. I mean, we may anticipate that. But they may do a better job at doing of increasing some of the other values that are in that decision mix, such as the environmental or maybe the social values. I think that's the purpose of the alternatives as they've been designed, to show a mix of strategies and policies. I don't know. That's the best I can answer that question at the moment.
What organization or agency exists or is needed to provide leadership toward new approaches to sustainable forestry?
There are some national commissions on sustainable forestry already at work here in the United States. Many higher education forestry colleges and forestry schools are certainly talking about it, trying to introduce those ideas into the curricula. So there are some efforts. The two large certification bodies that we've talked about are certainly promoting sustainability after following, in our case, the Montreal process, or over in Europe, the Helsinki process. So I think there are already new organizations that have spawned just in the last 8 to 10 years that are promoting this whole concept of sustainability.
But you know,
at the international level too, I should have said.
People talk about planning, though, and planning and doing are two different things. As one scientist said to me one day, the major thing that inhibits adaptive management is that no one wants to take the first step. And so taking the first step is, inviting criticism and everything like that. And I think that's what's looking at. Or let me go to this might be the last question, because I just got the 2-minute warning there. How will the academic community engage themselves in the discussions of sustainability in the face of ever-increasing demands for wood products?
Well, partly from what I just said, several forestry schools, colleges of forest resources, College of Natural Resources have programs, research programs and educational programs that address this whole question of sustainable forestry. Our college, as you've heard this morning, is certainly trying to play a bigger role in that. We look not only at the sustainable forestry side, but at the sustainable urban environment side and at the sustainable forest enterprises side. Forestry schools and colleges of forestry are about much more than just timber production, and they have been for many, many, many years. Many colleges of forestry, colleges of forest resources have been reorganized into larger units called natural resources colleges or natural resources and environmental science colleges. I don't think our college here at the university is any different. We're subject to those same pressures. That doesn't mean that forestry disappears. That doesn't mean that we don't have scientists and students and research programs that address forestry and forest production to try to address the issues in your question about the growing demand for wood products. It just means that we have to cast ourselves in a different format than we may have been used to in the past. And I think other schools are facing these same pressures. If Hamish was here, he could talk about UBC, because I know at the Faculty of Forestry, they've got the exact same issues that we face here at the College of Forest Resources.
Could I add one thing to that, or two things?
Yeah.
One thing might be relating back to that other question about institutions, is looking at maybe some different arrangements or different kinds of processes, studying those, providing case studies of things that work. The other component is just training some of those students to be those leaders, those risk takers, those people that will think creatively about how do we do this, and take some of those risks. And we're figuring out how we do that, but I think it's a process, as well as the product at the end hopefully would be a student that comes out with some of those skills that we haven't traditionally provided.
And so risk-taking is part of this.
Right.
Even
My opinion, so, but I think it is, yeah.
Just one last thing. How do different organizations look at the different legal and social constructs, and you know, the legal and social maybe constructs or impediments that that you have to deal with integrating sustainability across these landscapes? I mean, point out, maybe just kind of define this, because we have a limited amount of time, but are there legal constraints that you find that are just severe impediments towards sustainable resource management and sustainability? And if anybody wants to just go down the line and say yes or no, and then we'll try and get back to it. I mean, looking back at the history, the 30 or 35 years of laws that have led us up to this definition of sustainability at the federal and state levels.
I think, without naming any specific law, federal or state, I think one has to acknowledge that many laws are passed and regulations passed that are kind of single resource focused. And sustainability is all about integration and consolidation and looking across the three areas of influence. And so it wouldn't be surprising to me to see that there are some legal impediments just because of the way these regulations have been built. If one believes that sustainability really is that compromise across those three, some regulations may prohibit you from compromising to the point where you can actually have true sustainability as measured by ecological, economic, and social.
You agree with that, Susan?
Well, I think in the case of the Forest Service, very clearly our management is constrained by the legal requirements that we have to comply with. And perhaps, again, taking the example of the Northwest Forest Plan, I think that while the Northwest Forest Plan could provide for a certain output of timber, for example, that would help to support rural economies, there are legal requirements that constrain the ability of the Forest Service to produce those levels because of ecological concerns. So perhaps laws that promote more ecological sustainability could constrain our ability to contribute to economic sustainability in some ways. So you get back into these sort of trade-offs between the different, legs of the stool, and there's definitely an impact there.
Yeah. General agreement with that? Okay. Well, thank you all very much, and thank the audience for your superb questions. We didn't get to all of them, obviously. They can be worded back on email to various people. Send them all to Bruce Baer if you want. But really, truly, the College of Forest Resources will distribute them to the variety of people. Hamish Kimmons, as he indicated, had to go north across the border, and he indicated he would answer questions addressed to him as well. And so, thank you very much for your attendance at this Denman Forestry Issues series, and it's our pleasure to be part of this discussion.
I wish to thank you for joining us today for this edition of the Denman Forestry Issues series on seeking sustainability. For more information on this and other forestry topics, please send us an email to cfruw@u.washington.edu. Thank you.